Well, I want to welcome you all here today, okay? And I hope that you're all doing great. And if you're not, that's okay, because we have a great sermon for you today. At least I hope so, but then again, maybe I feel a little biased because I'm the one giving it, but I really do think that you're going to enjoy it. So, most people drink soda, or so I'm told, and if you're like my grandfather, that is all you drink. Coke has been at the top of the soda market for a really long time, and it was like kind of the Henry Ford of sodas for a while. But in the beginning of the 1980s, Pepsi had started to become so large, especially with the younger consumers, that Coke decided it needed to make a change. So it ended up doing 200,000 taste tests and found that people preferred a sweeter formula to Coke's old formula. And probably because Pepsi at the time had even gone so far as to claim the Pepsi generation as the new generation, which seems like a pretty big thing. So in 1985, Coke released a brand new product called the New Coke, which of course, if you're older, you might remember it. If you're younger, maybe not. And sales initially increased for a bit because everyone wanted to try what the New Coke was about. However, what they found is that sales quickly plummeted, and in fact, people started buying the old Coke more than the New Coke. And it got so bad that Coca-Cola headquarters had received 40,000 handwritten letters demanding that they change it back to the original formula because they didn't like the new sweeter taste. And the backlash was so huge that only 77 days later, Coke announced the return of the original formula in Coca-Cola Classic. Now, if you're younger than 25, you might not know about the soda wars of the 80s and 90s, but I can assure you they were real, and I lived through them. But Coke, like most businesses, just wanted to sell their product and make a profit. We can understand that. I can't really blame them for wanting to adapt, but in their adapting, they undercut the very thing that had made them popular in the first place. And it took thousands of letters and plummeting sales for them to realize that if people wanted a sweeter Coke, they could have it. It was called Pepsi. And there wasn't a way for Coke to satisfy their old customers and the people that wanted the new sweet taste of Pepsi, because Coke couldn't do that. Coke had to find a way forward, but it had to honor the past with respect to the changing marketplace. And thankfully, they solved that problem through a machine. You might have seen this at some of the newer restaurants, but it's this amazing machine that lets you have any base soda and add in over a dozen syrups. So if you want vanilla Coke, you can have vanilla Coke. If you want cherry Coke, you can have cherry Coke. If you want orange, cherry, vanilla, raspberry Coke because you're a sociopath, you can have that Coke too, okay? And they have you covered because Coke finally found a way to tailor itself to a larger audience without sacrificing what made it great, which was Coca-Cola. My point is that Coke, in an effort to try to be something its competitor was, ended up messing themselves up. And the solution for Coca-Cola wasn't to become Pepsi. It was to become a better Coke. And what if I told you that the Christian church has been fighting a similar battle for quite some time? That in 1859, a gentleman by the name of Charles Darwin published a book called On the Origin of Species, and it dramatically changed the way that we have understood Genesis and the Christian theology. As Hugh Ross put it in his Creation as Science, he says, prior to Darwin, most Christians accepted a straightforward reading of Genesis as described God's direct creation of life forms. And Darwin's theory introduced a naturalistic method, which we know as natural selection, for the diversity of life, challenging the idea of separate, specially created species. And this shift not only sparked theological conflict, but it also led many Christians to feel the need to reinterpret Genesis to accommodate evolutionary theory. Stephen Meyer, in the 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Design, he noted that the success of Darwin's theory encouraged many scientists to adopt a fully naturalistic approach to science, and that over time this approach led to the marginalization of theological explanations for the origins of life and the universe, and instead of seeing nature as evidence of design, many began to view it as the result of an unguided process. For hundreds of years, the Bible story was uncontested, and then finally a challenger had arisen, and using science, it challenged the prevailing theory. And what I think we've been seeing, certainly over the last few decades, is atheism is on the rise, and that the theory of evolution is now thought of as an uncontestable scientific fact. And that evolution, which they characterize as definitionally excluding God, is now not only the way forward, but we have to concede that we have to either believe in God or believe in science, and those are the only two answers. That, ladies and gentlemen, is not the answer. The answer is not to concede God to science, as atheists believe it's the only logical way of doing. The way forward is for us to strengthen our beliefs with science and understand that science is not against God. Science actually points to God, but now the burden of understanding how science proves God falls upon our shoulders. Our shoulders. When you have a monopoly, even on truth, you don't need to have good rebuttals because everyone just agrees. But when there's competition, then the burden of proof falls on those who believe they're in the right. And they have to have a defense for it. And it's not about your personal faith. This is about other people's faith. And in fact, the Bible commands us to have a defense of our faith when other people ask. 1 Peter 3:15 says this, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, and always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." Notice how it doesn't say, if you believe in the Bible, that's good enough and let other people just find their own reasons. Peter said, always be prepared to make a defense, which to me means you can't even say, I don't talk to people. You know, I'm just work alone. I don't even talk to people, because always means always. And in this verse, you should be prepared. At your workplace, you should be prepared. Thanksgiving meal with people of different political views, definitely be prepared. But you know what? It means, what always means is that even people inside this room should have a defense for their faith. When I think about it, everyone here agrees for the most part. Everyone here will give you the benefit of the doubt. And if you don't have a defense for people in this room that want everything for you, how are we going to expect any better or even the same to being treated outside? At people who are looking for ways to destroy everything Christ stands. But there's good news, and I do want to lift you up. For a while, especially if you talked to the scientists, it seemed like science was going to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that God was not necessary. And now, more than ever, science is pointing towards an intelligent designer, towards a creator, and God that created the universe and everything inside of it. And so the first scientific point I want to make is what's called the cosmic fine-tuning argument. Now, if you haven't heard of it, that's okay. I think you'll actually enjoy it. The fine-tuning argument is the observation that the fundamental physical constants and laws of the universe appear to be precisely calculated so that way life can even exist. And if even one of these constants was just slightly different off, that the universe would not be able to support stars, planets, or any complex chemistry, let alone life. Now, what are these constants? I think they're dreadfully boring things, like the gravitational constant, which if it were just slightly stronger, stars would burn through their fuel too quickly. And if it was slightly weaker, they would never ignite in the first place. And either scenario eliminates the possibility of life. Or the electromagnetic force constant, didn't hear that bad, and that controls how charged particles interact, which I'm sure that we deal with a lot of charged particles in our workplace. But just so you know, if the electromagnetic force constant was any stronger, it would prevent stable chemical bonding. And if it was any weaker, electrons wouldn't orbit nuclei, which meant no atoms, no chemistry, and no life. A strong nuclear force that binds protons and neutrons If it was 2% stronger, stars and even hydrogen, which is essential for water, that thing that we're kind of made up of 70% of, wouldn't exist. And if it was 2% weaker, only hydrogen would exist, which means no carbon, no oxygen, and no DNA. I won't go through all of them, but some of the other constants are the cosmological constant, the weak nuclear force, the ratio of electromagnetic force to gravity, and here I would end with this, the initial entropy conditions, which as described by physicist Roger Penrose, who was a collaborator with Stephen Hawking, described the universe as finely tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 10th to the 123rd power. And that is a number so large it almost defines human comprehension. Yet it is exactly what is required to have life and the stars in our cosmos. And to give you something to think about, imagine for yourself if you took a dime. I want you to take a dime and I want you to stack dimes from where I'm standing right now to the entire moon. And then I want you to do that in 1 billion universes. And then take 1 dime and paint it red. And put it anywhere in one of those billion stacks. And if you could pick that 1 red dime out of that stack, you still would not have as good of a chance, or have a lesser of a chance than the odds that our cosmos is made. Which means you would have better chances at that dime than creating this universe. That's how crazy it is. Luke Barnes, an astrophysicist and co-author of Fortunate Universe, wrote this: fine-tuning is not a theological argument. It's a scientific observation. And Stephen Hawking, who was no theist at all, I can tell you that, he famously said in A Brief History of Time in 1988, the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. And by the way, fine-tuning is not to make Earth look beautiful or special or whatnot. It is literally observations that are measurable and quantifiable that we can find in physics. So here's the question. What do we make of this? Now, if you're a materialist, meaning you only believe that matter and natural forces exist, then you actually have a pretty big problem. Because if everything is just random and unguided, then how in the world does a razor-thin alignment of constants come into being? Now, some scientists actually recognize this problem, because they wanted to find science. And they've proposed an alternative answer to this, and it is the multiverse. I'm not making it up. I'm not kidding you, the multiverse. So it's not just for Marvel, it's now in science, or what they're trying to find. And what that means is that the idea is there's an infinite number of universes. And when you have an infinite number of universes, no matter how big 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power is, that in an infinite number, you can at least find one, and that just so happens to be our universe. Yeah, it makes sense. There's only one big problem, is that none of these universes can be observed, none of these universes can be tested, and none of them can even be proved. Which you can see how that kind of goes against science when you can't prove, see, test, or in other words, measure anything because we are constrained by this universe. And that is how far scientists are now willing to go to try to get God out of the equation. As Stephen Meyer points out in his 4 views on evolution and intelligent design, the laws and constants of physics appear finely tuned to make life possible, and the appearance of design cries out for explanation. And a theistic design hypothesis explains this fine-tuning in a straightforward, causal, and adequate fashion. We're not talking about necessary theology. We're talking about math and physics and data, which is all boring, but strangely enough, is exactly what the atheists are clamoring Christians don't have, and yet we do. We absolutely have it. This naturally, of course, brings us up to a different but equally compelling point, which is the question of life. And here, the evidence doesn't get weaker, it actually gets stronger. Because in every living cell, there is an additional fine-tuning in information and in a code, and it's in a language. And that is the second scientific point I would like to bring up to you, and that's about our DNA, which everyone at least understands on a baseline that we all have. Now, you probably know that it's the genetic code of life, and we often forget just how literal the word code is. Okay, that DNA is not just a blueprint, though it is. It's actual information that's stored in the form of four chemical bases: cytosine, guanine, thymine, and adenine. Sorry, the last one didn't rhyme, okay? But these are not just molecules that are floating around randomly. They actually are arranged in highly specific sequences, and that's what allows us to build proteins, to regulate growth, to repair damage, and to sustain life. And it has to be very specific. It can't just be random. Now think for a second. Inside every single one of your cells is a string of code, like a biological software program. And that tells your cells how to function. And if even a single instruction in that code goes awry, the consequences can be dire. It can be disease, mutation, and even death. And what kind of crazy is it when I say that it's a software program? Well, you don't have to take my word for it. You can talk to the guy who designed the Windows operating system, Bill Gates. This is what he said about DNA. DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. So where does the code come from? And that really is a big question. And it's not a religious one per se, though we do have answers from a religious perspective. But often many scientists have that. They want the scientific explanation. But chemistry alone doesn't explain how you go from random molecules to structured functional code. You can't just get meaningful information from chance and chemistry. And at some point, you have to have a system that is capable of storing and interpreting symbolic instructions. And that, my friends, that's a big leap. To put it in perspective, the human genome is around 3 billion base parts, and that would be equivalent to about 1.5 gigabytes of digital data. So if you printed it all out in standard font, it would fill more than 1 million pages. Or to put it for more of the younger generation, if you were to download Shrek from the internet, it would be about 1.5 gigabytes, which means every cell has about the same information as Shrek on DVD. So that's a lot of Shreks, by the way. That's not just complexity, though. That is organized information. And as we know from every field of human experience, is that information comes from a mind. Whether it's a book, science, software program, or an instruction manual, all of those are created with a mind. And that mind means that there must be a designer. Stephen Meyer puts it this way in The Signature of a Cell: whenever we find information, we trace it back to its source. We always come to a mind, not a material process. And now some scientists will argue, well, sure, DNA looks like a code, but that doesn't mean it's coded in the same way, right? But here's the thing. It doesn't just look like a code, it functions like a code. So biologists even use terms like transcription, translation, and editing to describe what happens during protein synthesis. And those are not metaphors. They're actual, accurate descriptions of what cells are doing. They're reading, they're copying, and they're executing instructions. And you don't have that kind of behavior from physics and chemistry alone. Now here's where I think things get interesting, if it wasn't interesting already. Let's suppose for a moment that we somehow had all the raw materials needed for life. Okay, the amino acids, the sugars, the nucleotides, all that really sciencey stuff. That still doesn't get us to DNA. It's not just a presence of part that matters, it's how they're arranged. And so, do I have any bakers in the audience? Okay, like if I gave you ingredients to make a cake where we had flour and eggs and sugar and oil, that even if I just gave you that stuff, it doesn't magically, combine to make a cake. You have to make the cake. You have to set the oven. You have to mix it a certain way. And if you add too much or too little, the cake is a really bad cake. So what happens is that as a baker, we understand that you need sequencing, you need ordering, and you need intentionality. And now I want some cake. But that's okay. So here is the dilemma for the naturalistic science, is that if information requires intelligence and DNA is information, then doesn't it follow that DNA points to intelligence? And you don't have to be a Christian to ask that question. In fact, many scientists who are not believers at all have wrestled with that. Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of DNA's double helix and an atheist, was so perplexed by the origin of DNA that he proposed a theory called directed panspermia. And it's the idea that life was seeded on Earth by aliens. And I'm not joking. That's how hard it is to explain DNA while trying not to invoke God as the intelligent designer. Now, to be clear, the design inference doesn't tell us who the designer is, though we know who the designer is. That is the theological answer, and we have the answer for that, and we should post the answer. So if we see design in space, and if we see the same when it comes to biology, then why shouldn't we combine them and say we know who the author of both of those are, which we do. So, rather than see science as anti-God or on the other scope, or as a threat, I see it as an invitation to explore the possibility that life didn't come into existence by a cosmic accident, that there's a purpose behind the code and the meanings and the creation of our cosmos. And that's where the trail of evidence leads us, not just to a finely tuned universe, but to a finely crafted life. A universe calibrated for life that runs on code, both pointing to someone who made it all. And I'll just leave you with this, is that John 1:3 says, "Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made." In other words, in order to see the universe and the information embedded in it, life just didn't emerge randomly. It came through God. And we know this, and science backs it up. So as we look at the precision of physics and the programming of biology, we're not just marveling at science, we're seeing God's design at work, and the voice called into the universe being the same voice that called the stars and wrote the same line of code. He wants to have a personal relationship with you and with me. And thank you. So I want to leave time for some Q&A. There's a mic over there, so please just, if you have a question, just go to the mic and then say your question.
Is it working?
You might want to turn it on.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. If not, then you might just have to speak up.
All right. So I've heard of the God of the gaps argument and
Okay.
using God to explain things that, like, obviously what they used to think was magic is now God of the universe and is proven by science. But don't you think this is like just repackaging it so that when this becomes what we know, that science will prove this eventually? Like, it seems very far-fetched now, but...
Yeah. Sure. The God of the gaps argument, good question. So the God of the gaps argument, for those that are not familiar, the idea was a long time ago, we didn't have science, we didn't know how to explain things, and so we just kind of slammed God in there and say, like, God did this, and then science came along and we actually realized that, oh, it's not this God, it's actually science. And a good example would be like Apollos. So in mythology, they thought Apollos brought the sun, and then we learned that we revolve around the sun, and the sun isn't going anywhere. And so the idea is that God is just these gaps. The difference is that this is not, good question, but this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is because it's not about what we don't know. Because the idea of God of the gaps is we don't know, so we have to take God. This is actually what we do know, and we're using science to do it. It's really what science doesn't want to agree that it points to. So we know how many, we know about DNA, we know how many pairs are, and in fact, the things we don't know that science hasn't yet only points to more of a higher chance that there needed to be an intelligent creator, not less. So that's why this isn't trying to slap God onto things. It is an actual, we're using science and inferring God based on knowledge. But really, really great question.
Christians say that God is all good. But there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of war, a lot of conflict. So if God's all powerful and all good, why did he create a world that can allow for so much suffering and so much pain?
Yeah. No, good question. And that's like really great question. We're talking about evil and suffering. C.S. Lewis, one of a really good apologist, he said to judge I'll paraphrase him, but he said kind of to judge a house, you'd have to know what the purpose of it is. Is that because if a house is supposed to keep rain out, you can judge it, but if you don't know what it's there for, it's very hard to judge it, and you can't understand whether something is good or bad by simply looking at it. You have to know what it's there for. And I think that what is really interesting is that if God just said, I'm only going to have you go one way, you can only act one way, then there's no such thing as good and evil. There's just God's way, and that's it, because we're forcing. And so what ends up happening, and I think we know this, is we have choices, and to choose good, we have to have the ability to choose evil. That is why God constantly says, choose good, we want to be good. And when God, oftentimes it says, well, but God lets it happen, he allows it to happen, but the issue that you have is if God prevented all evil from happening, what we want to believe is that we somehow still have choice to just do good and not evil. And that's what I think we sometimes struggle with is once, if you tell someone not to push a big red button, what are they going to do? They're going to try and push that big red button over and over. And if you don't let them push the big red button, you know what? You're the mean guy. You're the monster. And that's what we don't realize is that the idea to choose bad is not God forcing you to choose bad. It's God hoping you choose good. And we know that. So that fact that there is evil is just because we have free will. It's not that God is trying to create a world of suffering. But thank you for the good question. Good question.
Okay, so we know that there are billions of galaxies out in the world, and we're here on Earth. But isn't it kind of arrogant for us to say God designed the world just for us when there's so many other galaxies out there, especially statistically, there's got to be life other than just on this one planet?
Sure, and that's a great question. So actually, Neil deGrasse Tyson he tries to answer that, and he begged the question. Last time I checked, he kind of just begged the question and said, there are so many, there must be. Okay, that is not statistics. That's not scientific. That is called begging the question. And rather than say, there's this many, and this is the statistical analysis, so therefore there must be more, it's the scientific answer, as much as I like Neil deGrasse Tyson, is not, there must be. That's not scientific. That's hoping and begging the question. But to your answer, oftentimes when we look at ourselves as humans, we think, why would God make an entire universe for us? And the answer is because he loves us. He loves us. And the answer is, if you really loved your children, and you had the ability to create a universe, why wouldn't you? Why couldn't you? If God is infinite, I think that creating the entire universe is still nothing to him. But I also say that you can take it one of two ways. You can either say this makes us so insignificant because we're just a tiny speck in this universe, and that may be true. Or you could say that we're loved by a God so much he created an entire universe solely as our backdrop. And I think that that's the answer. And as for the statistics, I can't really go into it, but there was a SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And they had created this algorithm or this thing of how many planets out should have life. And what they found is that when they started, they had just a few assumptions because they thought you just needed a sun, you just need to be in an inhabited zone, water, basic stuff. And what they realized as they started thinking more and more is that there's just so many assumptions that have to be in place for life to happen on a planet. One of the big things, and I won't go into all of them, but one of them I thought was really good was Jupiter. Didn't realize this. Jupiter, big planet. You know what it also does? Its gravitational pull sucks in asteroids so they don't arrive on Earth and were bombarded. And so one of the things that Jupiter has is you had to have other planets that would shield you from all the space space debris and all that, and we have that. And that was one of the big things is that even having an inhabitable zone without a Jupiter-like planet puts you at risk to have no life at all. And I just thought that was really kind of great, but good question. So statistically, that if you look at the research, it's really in depth. So it's not just as cut and dry as there's a lot of planets, so there must be more of us. And secondly, I think that we do believe in an amazing God that loves us enough, and he's absolutely willing to make an entire universe for our enjoyment. I'd love to continue, but we're really out of time. I just want to thank you so much for all that you're doing and letting me be here. God bless.